Welcome to the deep dive. We dig through complex stuff to find the key insights, basically helping you get up to speed fast. Today, we're tackling something fundamental, a question we all ask, why? Why did this happen? Whether it's a health issue or maybe shifts in the economy or even just like why your Wi-Fi acts up at the same time every day, we're always looking for causes. But here's the really interesting part. For ages, the actual scientific language to talk about cause and effect was, well, surprisingly basic. It often felt like we danced around the idea of causation, but didn't have the tools to really grab it.
It's kind of amazing when you think about it. I mean, way back, the poet Virgil said, "Lucky is he who has been able to understand the causes of things." That was 29 BC. And yet for literally thousands of years, we didn't really have a formal mathematical way to tackle causation scientifically. Even modern statistics, which gave us so many powerful tools, mostly kind of sidestep a direct definition. Think about it, most of us probably went through school, maybe even university stats courses, without ever seeing a specific mathematical symbol for cause. And there's a reason for that. It just didn't formally exist until quite recently.
Exactly. And that's really what we want to unpack in this deep dive. We're looking at what some are calling the causal revolution. This is a huge shift, really. It's finally given us a mathematical language for causation. So now we can go beyond just seeing that two things happen together, correlation, to actually understanding the mechanics underneath, the why behind the what. And as you'll hear, this new science, it's already changing things in really crucial areas. We're talking drug development, economic policy, education, even the future of AI. Consider this your shortcut to getting genuinely informed on something big with some pretty surprising facts along the way.
It really is a new science.
Yeah.
And the ripple effects are huge. We're seeing it connect fields that used to seem totally separate, all using this coherent framework that honestly barely existed a couple of decades back.
You know that phrase, right? Correlation is not causation. It's like statistics 101.
The classic example.
Yeah, the rooster crows, the sun rises, highly correlated. But the rooster isn't making the sun come up. It's fundamental, sure, but...
But that's often where the lesson stopped, traditionally. Statistics was great at teaching us what causation isn't, but it tended to shy away from defining what causation is. If you grab an older statistics textbook, good luck finding cause or effect in the index. Students learned X and Y are related or associated, but not really that X causes Y. It left this big gap in how we could approach problems scientifically and practically.
Okay, so this deep dive is really about filling that gap.
Precise.
So how do we get our heads around this? To really see why this is such a big deal, we need a kind of map. And our sources introduce this really neat concept, the ladder of causation.
Yep.
Think of it like 3 steps, 3 rungs on a ladder. Each rung represents a different level of thinking, a different kind of causal question we can ask. The rungs are seeing, doing, and imagining.
That's right. And climbing this ladder, it really marks different levels of intelligence, you could say, from just spotting patterns all the way up to deep understanding.
Okay, let's start at the bottom. Rung 1, seeing. This is all about association, prediction. You're passively observing the world, noticing patterns, like you see the barometer reading drop and you predict rain. Or you hear the rooster, you predict sunrise. It's based on what you see in the data, the correlations you notice.
And this level, seeing, is exactly where most of today's really powerful AI, machine learning, deep learning systems, this is where they operate. I mean, they do incredible things, right? Powering search engines, driving cars. But fundamentally, they work by finding patterns in massive amounts of data. They're data-driven in that sense. They fit functions to observations.
And this is the kicker, I think there's a big limitation. Our sources call these systems profoundly dumb about causes and effects. They're not flexible, they don't adapt well outside their training data because they only learn associative patterns. Like the example given is a self-driving car. If it's only trained on correlations, it won't just know that, say, a pedestrian who's stumbling and holding a bottle might react differently to a horn than someone else. It doesn't grasp the underlying cause and effect.
Exactly. They're amazing pattern matchers, but they don't inherently understand the why behind the patterns. They can tell you what happened, or maybe predict what is likely to happen based on past data. But ask them why it happened, or what would happen if you actively change something. That information isn't usually in the raw observational data they learned from.
Okay, so that brings us up to rung 2, doing. This is where we move from just watching to actually intervening, changing things. We start asking questions like, okay, what happens if we do X? Like, what happens to our floss sales if we double the price of toothpaste? Or maybe, what's the effect on student scores if we actually reduce class sizes? This needs a different kind of knowledge, right? Something beyond just seeing the patterns.
It does. And the sort of classic way, the gold standard for answering these interventional questions is the randomized controlled trial, the RCT. You hear about these all the time, especially in medicine. There's even a great historical example, the story of Daniel in the Bible. He basically proposed an experiment. Test a simple vegetarian diet against the king's rich food for 10 days, then compare. What he was doing is exactly the point of an RCT. You intentionally try to disassociate variables, get rid of other factors, confounders that could mess up your results, and hide the true causal link.
Right, confounding. That seems to be a huge issue. And this is where the causal revolution really makes its mark, isn't it? With this thing called the do operator. What is that, and why is it such a big deal?
It's a really crucial piece of notation. The do operator, maybe written like PLDOD, it lets us formally, mathematically, distinguish between two very different things. One is just seeing something, like observing that people who drink coffee tend to live longer. That's PLD. The other is actively doing something, like making people drink coffee, intervening. That's PLDOD. This operator allows us to predict the effect of that intervention, that doing, sometimes even using data where we didn't actually run the experiment observational data, if we have a good causal model.
Wow, okay, so you can kind of simulate an experiment mathematically.
In a sense, yes. It gives us a formal way to estimate the impact of actions.
That feels like a massive step. And you mentioned confounding earlier. That's always been a tricky thing in statistics, hasn't it? Trying to figure out if A causes B, or if there's some hidden C causing both. I remember reading something from Ezra Klein about how researchers sometimes over-control. They adjust for too many variables, thinking it makes the study better, but they might accidentally control away the very effect they're looking for.
That's a perfect example of the confusion that existed. Confounding was something statisticians argued about defining clearly for decades. The do operator and the causal diagrams that usually come with it, they give us precise graphical rules to identify what is a confounder and what isn't, and how to handle it properly. And what's really exciting is that new methods have emerged from this, like something called front door adjustment. This can let us estimate a causal effect even when we can't directly measure a key confounder. Maybe something like a person's motivation, which is hard to quantify.
That sounds almost like magic. Like figuring out a pyramid's height just from its shadow, as one source put it, a victory of mind over matter. There is this example of the Job Training Partnership Act study. They found that using this front door method on observational data gave results that were actually competitive with a full-blown, expensive RCT. That's pretty remarkable.
It really shows the power of having a solid causal model. It lets you squeeze insights out of data that people previously thought was impossible.
Okay, so we've seen seeing and doing. Now we climb to the top rung, rung 3, imagining. This is about counterfactuals. It's not just asking what will happen if we do X. It's asking what would have happened if things had been different. Like the example, would this prisoner still be alive if Rifleman A hadn't fired his shot?
Yeah.
You're comparing reality to a hypothetical world, one that didn't actually happen.
And this ability, this counterfactual thinking, is arguably a defining feature of human intelligence. It's something that really sets us apart from, well, most animals, and certainly from current AI systems that are purely data-driven or model-blind. It's absolutely fundamental to so much of what makes us human. Our sense of morality. Think of Eve in the Bible saying, the serpent deceived me. That's inherently counterfactual. Thinking about a path not taken. Free will, responsibility, regret. They all rely on this. And it's the engine of science too, right? Asking why did this happen implies imagining if the suspected cause hadn't been there. What if?
So if this counterfactual reasoning is so central to us, what does that mean for building smarter AI? Can we actually teach machines to think like this?
That's essentially the goal, or at least a major goal, for achieving what's called strong AI machines that can reason and think in ways much more like humans. Being able to handle counterfactuals algorithmically is seen as essential. It would let machines answer those deeper why questions, understand context and nuance better, maybe even develop a kind of self-awareness by reasoning about their own internal states or blueprints, as one source puts it.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and look back at some of the history here. Because this causal revolution didn't happen in a vacuum, there were some real battles fought over these ideas. Let's start with an unsung hero, Sewall Wright. He was a geneticist back in the early 20th century. What did he do that was so radical at the time?
Wright was doing amazing work on inheritance in guinea pigs, trying to figure out how traits like coat color were passed down. And he developed and used something called path diagrams. These diagrams were basically simple causal map, showing arrows from causes to effects. But using them was incredibly controversial because the dominant school of thought in statistics then, led by Carl Pearson, was strongly anti-causation. Pearson basically thought causation was a fuzzy, unscientific idea. For him, the peak of scientific rigor was correlation. He famously said something like, causation is simply perfect correlation.
Wow. So, Wright, using diagrams showing actual causal arrows, must have really ruffled some feathers.
Oh, absolutely. He got fierce pushback. Pearson's student, Henry Niles, wrote a paper pretty much dedicated to attacking Wright's methods in 1921.
But Wright's work was ultimately a triumph, wasn't it? He managed to combine what our source calls very mild, qualitative, and obvious assumptions.
Things like assuming the sun's coat color doesn't magically influence the parent's genetics. Pretty basic stuff.
Right. He combined those assumptions with years of actual guinea pig data, and from that he could draw these really specific quantitative causal conclusions. Like, he calculated that 42% of the variation in coat color was directly due to heredity. How did he bridge that gap?
His fundamental insight, which was decades ahead of its time, was that you can't get causal conclusions out of data unless you start with some causal assumptions, however simple. He realized you need to encode your beliefs about how the world works, the causal structure, before you can meaningfully interpret the correlations in the data. Pure number crunching wasn't enough. He needed the model plus the data.
That makes sense. You need the assumptions to guide the analysis. Okay, let's look at another huge case study, the smoking and lung cancer debate. It's kind of shocking, really, how long it took for the scientific consensus to form that smoking causes cancer. Decades. And a big reason was this lack of a formal language for causation. Even though the evidence seemed really strong, what did that early evidence show?
The evidence was incredibly powerful, even early on. You had researchers like Dole and Hill in the UK doing these pivotal studies. Their case control studies found things like, out of nearly 650 lung cancer patients, only 2 were non-smokers. That's an odds ratio of like 1.5 million to 1. And their later prospective studies, following people over time, showed heavy smokers had something like 24 to 29 times the lung cancer death rate of non-smokers. Plus, they showed a clear dose-response effect. The more you smoke, the higher the risk. Quitting lowered the risk. It looked pretty clear-cut.
Okay, so with numbers like that, why the holdup? Why was someone as brilliant and influential as R.A. Fisher, the statistician, so skeptical?
Fisher raised a really potent counter-argument known as the constitutional hypothesis. He suggested, well, maybe smokers are just inherently different from non-smokers. Perhaps there's some genetic factor or some personality trait that predisposes people both to taking up smoking and to developing lung cancer independently. If that were true, then the correlation between smoking and cancer wouldn't mean smoking caused cancer. It would just be that this other factor caused both. And because this hypothesis was hard to test directly back then, it cast a long shadow of doubt.
Right, the classic confounding problem again. But here's the amazing twist, the real irony. Much later, in 2008, researchers actually did find a gene, nicknamed Mr. Big, that does influence both smoking behavior, making people more likely to smoke heavily and less likely to quit, and lung cancer risk. So Fisher was kind of right about a genetic link. Did that blow the whole causal claim apart?
No, and this is where the nuance of modern causal analysis comes in. It's a fantastic illustration. Using tools like mediation analysis, which we can talk more about, researchers could disentangle the effects. They found that, yes, the gene has an effect, but it's mostly an interaction effect, meaning the gene mainly exerts its cancer risk if you smoke. It wasn't acting primarily as a confounder that explained away the smoking link. It mostly worked by increasing smoking, and then the smoking caused the cancer. The direct causal path from smoking remains strong.
Wow. So the very thing suspected of being a confounder actually helped clarify the mechanism. That's subtle.
Exactly. It shows how having the right causal model lets you ask and answer these more sophisticated questions.
And the human side of this story is just incredibly powerful. Some members of the U.S. Surgeon General's committee looking into this were smokers themselves. Louis Pfizer, a chemist on the committee, smoked 4 packs a day. Less than a year after the report came out concluding smoking causes cancer, he was diagnosed with lung cancer himself. He wrote to the committee saying, basically, my own case is more convincing than any statistic. He finally quit after losing a lung. It just shows the immense personal weight behind getting the causality right.
Absolutely. It underscores why moving beyond just correlation is so critical, especially when people's lives are literally at stake.
Okay, so these causal models help with complex issues like smoking. They also shed light on some really weird statistical paradoxes, right? Things that seem completely counterintuitive until you look at the underlying causal structure. Let's talk about the birth weight paradox. This is the bizarre finding that among babies born with low birth weight, those whose mothers smoked during pregnancy actually have a better survival rate than those whose mothers didn't smoke. I mean, that sounds like smoking is somehow protective for these tiny babies. What's going on there?
Yeah, it seems completely backwards, doesn't it? This is a textbook example of something called collider bias, sometimes also called M bias. It happens when you condition your analysis on a variable, in this case, low birth weight, which is a common effect of two other causes. So think about it. What causes low birth weight? Well, smoking is one cause, but another major cause is serious birth defects, which are often fatal. Now, if you only look at babies who have low birth weight, you've created a weird subgroup. In that specific group, smoking might appear linked to better survival simply because the other main cause of low birth weight, those severe birth defects, is so much more deadly. Smoking looks good only by comparison within that selected group.
Ah, I think I see. So focusing on the shared outcome, low birth weight, creates a misleading link between the causes.
Precisely. Smoking and fatal birth defects might be unrelated in the general population, but once you select only babies affected by one or the other, those with low birth weight, they become artificially linked in your data. Causal diagrams make this kind of bias visually obvious. You can see the arrows colliding at the low birth weight variable. Without these diagrams, epidemiologists actually debated this paradox for something like 40 years.
That's incredible. And it's not just in medical statistics, right? This collider bias can pop up in everyday situations, too. There's this great example from the mathematician Jordan Ellenberg. He asks, have you ever noticed that among the people you date, the really attractive ones often seem to be, well, jerks?
I've heard that one.
Instead of some complex psychological theory, he suggests it might just be collider bias. Think about who makes it into your dating pool. Maybe you filter for people who are either attractive or have a great personality. But you probably wouldn't date someone who is both unattractive and has a bad personality. So by selecting on dateability, the collider, you might inadvertently create a situation where among the people you do date, attractiveness and niceness appear negatively correlated, even if they aren't in the general population.
It's a brilliant, relatable example. It really shows how our intuition about patterns can sometimes mislead us if we don't think carefully about the underlying causal process, the data-generating mechanism.
Yeah, our brains are pattern matching machines, but sometimes the patterns are statistical illusions.
Right. And another famous one is Simpson's paradox. This is where, say, a new drug might look like it increases the risk of heart attack when you look at men alone, and it also increases the risk when you look at women alone.
Okay.
But then when you combine the data and look at the overall population, the drug appears to decrease the risk of heart attack.
Wait, how is that even possible? That sounds completely contradictory.
It feels like it breaks math, but it's a real phenomenon. Resolving it absolutely requires you to look beyond the data to the data-generating process, as the source material puts it. You need a causal diagram to understand why the drug was given to different groups. Maybe sicker people got it more often, for example. Only the causal story tells you whether you should trust the results for men and women separately or the combined result. The raw numbers alone are ambiguous.
So the data itself isn't enough. You need the causal context.
Exactly. The numbers don't speak for themselves. The causal model tells you how to interpret them.
Okay, this is all fascinating. As we look ahead, what are some of the key tools this causal revolution gives us? You mentioned the do operator. There's also something called the do calculus.
Yes. The do calculus is essentially the logical engine that works with the do operator. Think of it like a set of rules, almost like Euclid's axioms in geometry. There are just 3 fundamental rules. These rules provide a complete algorithmic way to manipulate causal expressions. If it's possible to figure out the effect of an intervention, a do operation, from the data you have, even if it's observational data mixed with some causal assumptions, these rules will find the way. They let you mathematically transform the question, what if we do X, into something you can actually estimate from the data you have, effectively removing the do operator.
So it's like a systematic way to solve for causal effects.
Pretty much. It mechanizes the process of causal inference in many situations.
And that links into another powerful tool, mediation analysis. You touched on this with the smoking gene example. This seems really key to getting at the deeper why, understanding how a cause leads to an effect.
Yes, mediation analysis is all about unpacking the pathways. Does A cause C directly? Or does A cause B, which then causes C? B would be the mediator. Understanding these mechanisms is often crucial. Is a drug lowering blood pressure, and that's what reduces heart attacks? Or does the drug have some other direct protective effect?
It seems obvious now that we'd want to know that, but apparently understanding mediation formally was a challenge.
It was, surprisingly. In fact, Judea Pearl, a key figure in this revolution and author of one of our main sources, calls his initial misunderstanding of mediation one of his three greatest blunders. He initially thought that indirect effects, these mediated pathways, didn't have a clear operational meaning because you couldn't always isolate them with simple interventions. He thought they were just theoretical constructs. It was a major breakthrough when he realized that counterfactuals rung 3 thinking provided the key. You could define and quantify mediation precisely by asking counterfactual questions like, what would the outcome be if we blocked the direct path but left the indirect path open?
And this has real consequences. The example of scurvy is chilling. For a long time, doctors thought it was the acidity of citrus fruits that cured scurvy. Acidity was the assumed mediator.
Right. And that led to disaster when the British Navy switched from Spanish lemons, high in vitamin C, to West Indian limes, lower in vitamin C, especially after processing. They thought the acidity was the key, but it wasn't. The true mediator was vitamin C. Sailors started getting scurvy again because the assumed mechanism was wrong. Properly understanding mediation helps avoid those kinds of terrible mistakes.
Okay, one more really futuristic sounding area, transportability. This sounds like taking results from one study, say in one city, and figuring out if they'll apply in a totally different city or population. Is that right?
Yes, that's the core idea. It's about external validity. Can we generalize findings? Traditionally, this was seen as a huge problem, almost intractable. How do you combine results from studies done on different populations, maybe using slightly different methods, and then predict what will happen in a new population you haven't even studied yet?
It sounds incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible.
Experts used to call it a miracle or inconceivable. But work in the causal revolution has shown that, using causal diagrams, we can develop formal criteria for when transportability is possible. We can map out how populations differ and determine if and how we can adjust the findings from one context to make valid predictions in another. It turns the differences between studies, which used to be seen just as threats to validity, into potential sources of information.
That's a complete paradigm shift, taking variability and using it to your advantage.
Not exactly. It's about leveraging all available knowledge structured by causal understanding.
So let's bring it all together. We've climbed this ladder of causation from seeing patterns to doing interventions to imagining counterfactuals, and it feels like the big message for AI is what?
The big message is that while current AI, especially deep learning, is incredibly powerful at rung 1, seeing diagram, it's fundamentally limited. To get to truly intelligent machines, strong AI systems need to be able to operate on all 3 rungs. We need to integrate causal reasoning capabilities, machines that can understand interventions, ask and answer what-if questions, grasp underlying mechanisms. That's likely the path towards AI that can reason, adapt, and maybe even understand in a way that resembles human cognition.
So wrapping this up for everyone listening, what's the big takeaway? This causal revolution, it's not just academic. It gives us and you the tools to dig deeper than just correlations. It helps us understand the actual cause and effect relationships shaping our world. Learning this language, even just the basics of causal diagrams, can really empower you to look at news reports, studies, even everyday situations, and ask better questions, challenge assumptions, and ultimately make more informed decisions.
It really is about shifting from just seeing surface patterns to understanding the hidden machinery underneath. It changes how you engage with information and with reality itself.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. We've talked about how imagination, rung 3 thinking, counterfactuals, how fundamental that is to human intelligence, science, maybe even free will. If that's the case, what kind of incredible new things might become possible? What frontiers might we unlock when we finally succeed in teaching our machines not just to see patterns and execute actions, but to truly imagine?